Picture this. You're fast asleep on a plane, dreaming of home, when suddenly the captain's voice cuts through the cabin like a knife. But he's not talking about turbulence or the weather. He's asking if anyone on board knows how to fly a plane. Yeah, you heard that right. On a commercial flight, at 30,000 feet, the captain is basically saying, "Help, we need a pilot up here." What would you do? What could you possibly do? Well, let me tell you about Sarah and the most terrifying 15 minutes of her life that changed everything she thought she knew about herself. Sarah Martinez was curled up in seat 13F, completely zonked out after the week from hell. You know those business trips that drain every ounce of energy from your soul? That was her week. 3 cities, endless meetings, and presentations that felt like they'd never end. All she wanted was to get home to her daughter Emma, who was probably already asleep by now, clutching that ratty stuffed elephant she refused to throw away. The cabin was that perfect kind of quiet you get on red-eye flights. People sleeping, others scrolling their phones with the brightness turned way down, flight attendants moving like ghosts between the rows. Sarah had wrapped herself up in that thin airline blanket that never quite covers everything, pulled her cardigan tight, and let the steady hum of the engines rock her to sleep. But then everything changed. The chime wasn't the usual "fasten your seatbelt" ding. It was sharper, more urgent. Then came that voice over the intercom, and honestly, it's the kind of announcement that makes your blood run cold. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Captain Rodriguez speaking. If there is anyone on board with flight experience, anyone who has piloted an aircraft, please identify yourself to the flight crew immediately. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. You're on a plane, right? There's supposed to be 2 trained pilots up front. So, why on earth would the captain be asking passengers if they know how to fly? The silence that followed was deafening. Not the comfortable quiet of people sleeping, but the thick, heavy silence of 280 people all thinking the exact same terrifying thought. Sarah's eyes snapped open. For a moment, she thought she was still dreaming. Maybe her exhausted brain had conjured up some nightmare scenario. But then she heard the whispers starting around her. A businessman across the aisle leaned toward his wife and hissed, "Did he just ask for a pilot? On our plane?" Behind her, someone's voice cracked as they whispered, "Oh my God, what's happening up there?" The fear spread through that cabin like wildfire. You could feel it in the air, thick and suffocating. Passengers started sitting up straighter, craning their necks, looking around desperately as if anyone, might stand up and save them all. But nobody moved. Nobody spoke up. Sarah felt her heart hammering against her ribs. Because here's the thing nobody else on that plane knew. She had been a pilot. Not commercial airlines, but she'd spent years flying private aircraft. Before Emma was born, before she'd switched careers, before that terrible day that made her swear she'd never touch the controls of an aircraft again. She'd learned to fly when she was 23, fresh out of college, and full of dreams about soaring through clouds. There's something magical about being alone in a cockpit, just you and the endless sky. The way the controls respond to your touch, the delicate dance between power and grace, the absolute focus required to keep tons of metal floating through the air. She'd been good at it too. Really good. But that was a lifetime ago. That was before the accident that killed her best friend Marcus. Before she'd walked away from aviation forever, choosing the safe, predictable world of corporate consulting over the dangerous beauty of flight. Now she was just another passenger in seat 13F, watching a flight attendant move down the aisle with panic barely contained behind her professional smile. The woman's voice was steady, but Sarah could see her hands shaking as she repeated the captain's desperate request. "If anyone has any piloting experience, any experience at all, please let us know right now." The seconds stretched like hours. Sarah's mouth went dry.
Her palms were sweating.
Every rational part of her brain was screaming that this wasn't her problem, that she hadn't flown in 8 years, that she'd probably forgotten half of what she once knew. What if she made things worse? What if people died because she wasn't good enough anymore? But then she looked around the cabin. Really looked. At the elderly couple holding hands so tightly their knuckles were white. At the young mother clutching a sleeping toddler to her chest. At the teenager with tears streaming down his face as he texted what might be his last message to someone back home. These weren't just passengers anymore. They were people. Human beings with families and dreams and fears, all trapped in a metal tube hurtling through the sky with apparently no one qualified to land it safely. The flight attendant reached her row, and their eyes met. Sarah saw the desperation there, the barely controlled terror of someone who knew exactly how bad things were up in that cockpit. And in that moment, Sarah made a choice that would haunt her for the rest of her life, one way or another. "I can fly," she said quietly. 3 simple words that changed everything. The relief that flooded the flight attendant's face was almost heartbreaking. Within seconds, Sarah was being escorted up the aisle, past rows of faces turned toward her like flowers following the sun. She could feel their hope pressing down on her shoulders like a physical weight. These people were putting their lives in her hands based on nothing more than 3 words spoken in desperation. Her legs felt like jelly as she walked. Her hands were shaking. But she kept moving forward, because what else could she do? Sometimes life doesn't give you time to be ready. Sometimes it just demands that you act, ready or not. The cockpit door opened, and Sarah stepped into her worst nightmare. Captain Rodriguez was slumped in his seat, unconscious, his face gray and covered in sweat. He'd apparently suffered some kind of medical emergency, maybe a heart attack or a stroke. The first officer, a young guy who couldn't have been much older than Sarah, was alone at the controls, and he was falling apart. His hands were darting frantically over switches and dials, sweat pouring down his face, his breathing rapid and shallow. He wasn't incapacitated, but he might as well have been. Panic had taken over, and Sarah recognized the signs immediately. She'd seen it before in training in emergency situations. When fear takes control, even experienced pilots can become useless. The first officer, his name tag read Thompson, spun around when he saw her. "You're a pilot?" The hope in his voice was painful to hear. "Private aircraft," Sarah said, sliding into the captain's seat before she could lose her nerve. "It's been 8 years, but I remember the basics. What's our situation?" There wasn't time for doubt anymore. The plane needed guidance, and Thompson needed someone steady beside him. As Sarah's hands found the familiar positions on the controls, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years. The aircraft spoke to her through her fingertips, telling her its speed, its altitude, its attitude. The instruments made sense again, the radio chatter. From air traffic control filtered through her consciousness, like a language she'd thought she'd forgotten. Thompson started rattling off their status, and gradually, his panic began to subside as he had someone to share the burden with. They were at 31,000 feet, about 40 minutes from the nearest major airport. Fuel was fine. Weather was clear. All they had to do was bring 280 people safely back to Earth. All they had to do.
Right.
As they worked through the approach procedures, Sarah's mind began to flood with memories she'd spent 8 years trying to suppress. She remembered her first solo flight, the incredible rush of being alone in the sky with nothing but skill and courage between her and disaster. She remembered the precision required, the split-second decisions, the absolute focus that flying demanded. And she remembered Marcus. They'd been flying together that day, 2 young pilots full of confidence and dreams. A routine flight that went horribly wrong when weather moved in faster than predicted. She'd been piloting when the microburst hit, when their small aircraft was suddenly fighting winds that could tear it apart. She'd fought the controls, done everything right, but sometimes everything right isn't enough. Marcus died in that crash. Sarah survived with nothing worse than a broken arm and psychological scars that ran deeper than any physical injury. She'd blamed herself, of course. Pilots always do. Could she have reacted faster? Made a different choice? Seen the danger signs earlier? That guilt had driven her from the cockpit and into the safe, predictable world of business consulting. No lives in her hands, no split-second decisions that could mean the difference between life and death. Just spreadsheets and presentations, and the comfortable illusion that she could control her environment. But now, 8 years later, life had dragged her back to exactly where she'd sworn she'd never be again. In a cockpit, with lives depending on her, staring down her deepest fears. Thompson was talking her through the approach procedures for the airport they were diverting to. Sarah listened carefully, her hands steady on the controls now, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought left off. The radio crackled with instructions from air traffic control, vectors and altitudes and clearances that painted a path through the sky toward safety. In the cabin behind them, 280 people waited in the kind of silence that comes with barely controlled terror. Some prayed. Others held hands with strangers. A few sent what they thought might be final text messages to loved ones. They didn't know about Sarah's history, about the accident that had driven her from flying, about the guilt and fear she'd carried for 8 years. All they knew was that their lives were in the hands of a woman from C-13F who'd said she could fly. The descent began. Sarah felt the familiar sensation of the aircraft responding to her inputs, the subtle changes in engine tone and airflow that told her everything was working as it should. But her heart was pounding so hard she could hear it over the engine noise. Her hands were slick with sweat despite the cool air in the cockpit. "You've got this," Thompson said quietly, and Sarah realized he was no longer the panicked young officer who'd been falling apart when she'd first entered the cockpit. Having someone competent beside him had restored his confidence, and now he was trying to do the same for her. The runway appeared ahead of them, a thin gray line stretching across the landscape like a lifeline thrown to drowning swimmers. Sarah began the final approach, adjusting power and attitude with the kind of precision that comes only from thousands of hours of practice. Her hands moved almost without conscious direction, reading the aircraft's needs through tiny vibrations and responses that most people would never notice. "Flaps 20, she called out, and Thompson responded immediately. The landing checklist flowed between them like a conversation, each item checked off with the calm efficiency of professionals doing what they were trained to do. But inside, Sarah was fighting the biggest battle of her life. Every instinct screamed at her to pull up, to go around, to do anything except continue this approach that could end in disaster. The memory of that day with Marcus played on a loop in her mind, the terrible sound of metal tearing, the way the aircraft had shuddered and died around them. She could fail. She could kill everyone on this plane. She could prove that walking away 8 years ago had been the right choice, that she'd never been good enough for this responsibility. 200 feet, Thompson called out, his voice steady now. The ground rushed up toward them. Sarah could see cars on the highway beside the airport, tiny dots moving along ribbons of asphalt. Normal people living normal lives, unaware that 280 lives hung in the balance just overhead. 100 feet. The runway filled her vision now, white centerline stripes flashing past as they descended toward touchdown. Sarah's hands made tiny adjustments, reading the wind, feeling for that perfect moment when the aircraft would settle onto the pavement like a bird coming home to roost. 50 feet. This was it. The moment that would define the rest of her life, one way or another. Sarah thought about Emma, asleep in her bed at home, expecting her mom to walk through the door in a few hours with a hug and maybe a small present from her business trip. She thought about all the families represented in the cabin behind her, people whose entire worlds depended on the next 30 seconds. And then she thought about Marcus, and for the first time in 8 years, she didn't feel guilt. She felt him with her, the way he'd always been during those long training flights, calm and confident and absolutely certain that she could handle whatever the sky threw at her. 20 feet. The main landing gear kissed the runway with barely a bump. The nose wheel followed a second later, and suddenly they were rolling, not flying, the aircraft bleeding off speed as Sarah applied the brakes and reverse thrust. The sound that erupted from the cabin was unlike anything she'd ever heard. Cheers and sobs and applause all mixed together in a wave of pure relief and gratitude that seemed to shake the entire aircraft. People were hugging strangers, crying, laughing, calling loved ones to say they were okay. Sarah sat in the captain's seat, her hands still on the controls, tears streaming down her face. She'd done it. They'd done it. Everyone was safe. Emergency vehicles surrounded the aircraft as it came to a stop, but there was no emergency anymore. Just 280 people who'd get to go home to their families, who'd get to hug their children and continue living their lives because a woman from seat 13F had remembered that sometimes courage isn't about not being afraid. Sometimes it's about being terrified and doing what needs to be done anyway. When Sarah finally walked back through the cabin, every face turned toward her. Some people reached out to touch her arm, to shake her hand, to whisper, "Thank you," through tears of relief. A little girl, maybe Emma's age, looked up at her with wide eyes and said, "You're a hero." But Sarah didn't feel like a hero. She felt like someone who'd finally come home after being lost for 8 years. In the days that followed, the media called her the angel from row 13F. They wanted interviews, wanted her story, wanted to turn her into some kind of inspirational figure. But Sarah mostly just wanted to go back to her quiet life with Emma, to return to the comfortable predictability of her consulting work. Except she couldn't. Something had awakened in that cockpit, something she'd buried under years of guilt and fear. She'd remembered who she used to be, who she maybe still was underneath all the safe choices and careful living. 3 months later, Sarah was back in flight training, working toward her commercial pilot's license. It wasn't easy, starting over at 34, having to prove herself all over again. But every time doubt crept in, every time the fear tried to take hold, she remembered that day. She remembered 280 people who'd trusted her with their lives, and how it had felt to deliver them safely home. Emma was proud of her mom, the pilot, though she made Sarah promise to always come home safely. It was a promise Sarah intended to keep, not by avoiding risk, but by being the best, most careful, most skilled pilot she could possibly be. Because here's what Sarah learned that day at 30,000 feet, something that took 8 years and a desperate captain's announcement to understand. Running from your fears doesn't make them go away. It just makes you smaller. And sometimes, when the world needs you most, fear becomes irrelevant next to the simple human necessity of doing what's right. Now, I want you to think about your own row 13F. What's that thing you've been running from? That skill or calling or dream you've convinced yourself you're not ready for anymore? What would happen if life suddenly demanded that you step up, that you remember who you used to be before fear made you settle for less? Maybe you won't ever have to land a plane full of strangers. But somewhere out there, someone needs exactly what you have to offer. Someone needs your particular combination of skills and experience and courage. Someone needs you to stop hiding in the comfortable middle seats and move up to where the real action is. The question isn't whether you're ready. Sarah wasn't ready either. The question is whether you'll answer when life calls your name. Because sometimes the most extraordinary thing about ordinary people is their willingness to be extraordinary when it matters most. Sometimes a sleeping passenger becomes a hero. Sometimes row 13F becomes the most important seat on the plane. Your moment might not come with a captain's announcement and panicked passengers. It might come as a job opportunity you don't feel qualified for, or a relationship that requires more vulnerability than feels safe, or a creative project that demands you risk failure in pursuit of something beautiful. But when it comes, remember Sarah. Remember that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision that something else is more important than fear. Remember that you don't have to be perfect to be exactly what someone needs. And remember that sometimes the thing you're most afraid of returning to is exactly where you're meant to be. So, here's my challenge for you. Stop hiding in row 13F. Stop sleeping through the moments when life asks if you're ready to step up. Stop letting fear convince you that your best days are behind you or that you're not qualified for what's ahead. The cockpit is waiting.
The controls are there.
And somewhere, someone needs exactly what you have to offer. Are you ready to answer the call? If this story made you think about your own untapped potential, if it reminded you that courage lives inside all of us just waiting for the right moment to emerge, hit that like button and let me know in the comments what your own row 13F moment might be. What's that thing you've been running from that might actually be exactly where you need to go? And don't forget to subscribe for more stories that challenge you to see your own life differently. Because sometimes one story can change everything about how we see ourselves and what we're capable of. Thanks for flying with us today. Now go be the hero someone's been waiting for.